Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 6th of April and the 14th week of 2012. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Ron Szoke and David Green. We'll take turns suggesting overlooked or misreported items from the week's news, and then answer questions and comments from the others about them. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who has been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years that we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is Friday, April 6, the Friday called Good by Western Christians this year. It commemorates the execution by an army of occupation in Palestine of a first-century Jew who announced that the kingdom of God, the first human and humane society, was at hand. Execution was by hanging, the standard method employed by the state at that time. Of course, if the execution had been some years later, instead of little gold crosses on chains around their necks, Christians would wear little gold electric chairs, or perhaps in the age of Obama, little gold drones. However, the state is killing people at the time. The execution of Jesus stands as an example of what happens when the truly human tries to be present in our inhuman world, our political world that's based on lies and domination and fear. Tonight begins Passover. In the book called Exodus, the book of going out, the one that Jesus spoke of as Father is presented as saying, I am Yahweh, your liberator, who brought you out of slavery. You shall have no gods before me. Yahweh is the God of freedom, and there are to be no other gods. The prohibition of other gods, it has been said, is the basic demand made of Israel. The important thing is not just to be religious, to worship something somehow. The important thing is to find or to be found by the right God and to reject and struggle against the others. The worship of any other God is a form of slavery. To pay homage to the forces of nature, to the spirit of a particular place, to a nation or a race, or to anything that's too powerful for you to understand or control, is to submit to slavery and degradation. The religion of the Hebrew Bible begins by saying to such gods, I do not believe and I will not serve. The only true God is the God of freedom. The other gods make you feel at home in a place. They have to do with the quiet cycle of the seasons, with the familiar mountains in the country you grew up in and love. With them, you know where you are. But the harsh God of freedom calls you out of all this into a desert where all the old familiar landmarks are gone, where you cannot rely on the safe workings of nature on springtime and harvest, where you must wander over the wilderness waiting for what God will bring. This God of freedom will allow you none of the comforts of religion. Not only does he tear you away from the old traditional shrines and temples of your native place, but he will not even allow you to worship him in his old way. You are forbidden to make an image of him by which you might wield numinous power. You are forbidden to invoke his name in magical rites. You must deny the other gods, and you must not treat Yahweh as a god, as a power you could use against your enemies or to help you succeed in life. Yahweh is not a god. There are no gods. They are all delusions and slavery. You are not to try to comprehend God within the conventions and symbols of your time and place. You are to have no image of God, because the only image of God is humanity. Chag Sameil, you're listening to News from Neptune, the Good Friday Passover edition. Ron Szoke has the first outrage.
Yes. Mitt Romney charged this week.
That's all you have to say.
That Obama spent too much time at Harvard. Is that what's wrong with you? Actually,
I spent more time than either of them did there, and
Yeah,
also
actually,
the disease is worse, I guess.
Obama was there for 3 years and
Right.
Romney for 4,
Right.
but most people won't know that. But anyway, it's really
I spent many years as a senior at Harvard.
yeah, telling comment apparently. I'd like to call attention to the great socio-political experiment that I think is going on now. How extreme can inequality become before it results in obvious social breakdown?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're seeing the consequences in divorce, suicide, rioting, as in Greece, the rash of murder-suicides that we're reading about every day. Again and again, we read that these people have massive debts. And what is it doing to the social fabric, this degree of inequality, so many people who are being cast out and impoverished, humiliated by the socioeconomic system that we seem to be trying to operate under. And I don't have anything especially startling to say about that. Just mention the case that was very prominent apparently in Greece last week, the elderly man in Athens. This says a 77-year-old Greek man took his life in Athens' central Syntagma Square on Wednesday, leaving behind a note linking his actions to the country's deepening economic crisis. The man shot himself with a handgun in a grassy area to one side of the Greek capital's main square during the morning rush hour. His death added to a sharp rise in the number of suicides in the country that has coincided with the years of recession and subsequent austerity, measures that have cut deeply into the country's standard of living. Another note from Reuters, a Greek pensioner's suicide outside Parliament has quickly become a symbol of the pain of austerity and has been seized upon by opponents of the budget cuts imposed by Greece's international lenders. The 77-year-old retired pharmacist shot himself in the head on Wednesday after saying that financial troubles had pushed him over the edge. A suicide note said he preferred to die rather than scavenge for food. The highly public and symbolic nature of the suicide prompted an outpouring of sympathy from Greeks who set up an impromptu shrine where he killed himself with handwritten notes condemning the crisis. Some protested at night, clashing with riot police who sent them home in clouds of tear gas. So how far can this go before the signs of social breakdown become all too obvious? We've seen it again and again in Latin America and elsewhere that the privileged class, the 1%, will not give up their position. They seem really incapable of doing so until there are barricades and flames in the streets, and then because they control the firepower, they will try to hold on in that way. But do we ever learn? I don't know. But I'll just make that note and reserve some more for later.
Okay, good. Comments, David?
Well, I guess so.
How unequal are you feeling these days?
My question is, what accounts for the, as far as I can tell, general passivity of the Greek people in relation to what's going on? One sort of expected that there was enough support for, and there may be if upcoming elections turn out in a way that's not favorable to the acceptance of the European Union standards, but or demands in terms of austerity. But what accounts for the lack of mobilization in Greece against what I think are the majority of the population certainly recognizes to be an unfair austerity program?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, a classic question, of course. how can so few people maintain control over such large numbers of people who are deeply dissatisfied and frustrated? And it's a continuing question. A lot of people have been trained by birth, I suppose, to be kind of sheep who look up to their leaders for some sustenance and in vain. All we like sheep have gone astray. And the sheep look up and are not fed. To invent some phrases you can quote.
There's Ron quoting the Bible again.
But the question, I mean, it seems to me it's either or both. The fact that it's a lot of trouble getting rid of getting rid of the old system and thinking up of a new system, and it's going to cause, even among people, it's one thing for people to be, enough of the population apparently isn't desperate enough yet to suffer the relative inconvenience of doing something drastic.
Well, yeah, the opportunity costs of not doing it are farther in the future. It's harder to imagine and to have much foresight about what that's going to be. But yeah, it's a difficult matter.
There's a note, there's passage that our resident deity, Noam Chomsky, frequently quotes. He says, in considering the first principles of government, and writing that, David Hume found, and he's quoting Hume here, nothing more surprising than to see the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and to observe, your point, Ron, and to observe the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of the rulers. This is the middle of the 18th century when he's writing this, of course. When we inquire by what means this wonder is brought about, we shall find that as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. 'Tis therefore on opinion only that government is founded. And this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular. Now, Chomsky, when he quotes this, often points out that Hume may well be underestimating the efficiency of force in repression. Repression works. But the general point is well taken, that there is that control of opinion, that control of the popular mind that's so necessary to make sure that the oppressed do not rise up. And the great panic on the part of the rulers, and I would say here we're talking about our own society as well as Europe today and Europe several centuries ago. The panic on the part of the rulers when they do is very great, and they move quite vigorously against it. So I think one of the stranger things that's happening, well, right now, well, I don't know how strange it is, one of the more effective ways in which this matter is being handled by our rulers here and abroad at the moment is by control of information.
Yes.
There, in fact, has been a fair amount of popular protest, major riots, a general strike in Spain, and these things simply aren't covered in the American media. Very few Americans know that there was recently a general strike in Spain. Very few people know even about the ongoing demonstrations against austerity in Greece and Italy, or that demonstrations of that sort are general across Europe, not just limited to those two countries. So, I don't know. I mean, the one possibility is that something is brewing. I noticed the head of the Northern League, the sort of National Front Party in Italy, Umberto Bossi, has just stepped down. And this was a party that was constructed around one man, sort of like Le Pen's party in France or Berlusconi's party in Italy, for that matter. But he stepped down because of what seems to be a financial scandal. What's happening is that in Italy, the political parties are reforming in a new way under a government that's essentially been imposed by European bankers, an unelected government imposed by the bankers. The situation is similar in Greece. The situation is moving that way in Spain and Portugal. In Ireland, the unelected government or the elected government has done what the bankers have told them to with no problem. But in each of these cases, there's stirrings beneath the surface, so to speak. So the answer may be, Ron, that the stirrings are taking place, and we're literally not hearing about them.
Yes, yes.
And on the other hand, in contrast to the information we don't get about places like Spain, the information we do get about conflict and rebellion in a place like Syria is it not necessarily, it also in its own ways misinforms us, of course, about the nature of that conflict.
Well, and also the connections are not made between the situation in Europe and the U.S. I mean, people, for the most part, don't notice that the situations are more similar than the rulers in either place want to admit. That austerity is simply the European name for deficit politics in America. And they also don't notice, which may even be the most important thing, that this is that the present situation is the working out of a political program that's been with us for at least a generation. That neoliberalism is a term that's barely used in American politics, and it arguably describes the most effective political program in America in the last 30 years. So when you have neoliberal regimes in Europe and America who want to keep quiet what they're doing, the cooperation of the media and our notion that politics has to do with what Ann Romney has said recently, rather than whose interests are being served, you've got a fairly effective system for our rulers there.
Yeah, so we need to unzip Mitt Romney.
I admit she does say some things that he couldn't make up. But,
right, he's perceived as too stiff. And,
it would probably be better to unzip the economy and talk about what's really. I mean, I think you start with precisely the crucial question: how extreme can inequality become? Most Americans, I think, still don't realize the rapid and accelerating growth of inequality over the last generation in this country. You had a chart a week ago, Ron, in which you showed what people thought about the division of wealth in the country and how skewed that was from the much more skewed actual division of wealth. Yeah. That's important. Yeah. I mean, Americans don't realize how bad things are.
They don't realize that most of them haven't gotten a raise for 30 or 40 years.
Yes, yes.
Right. We all think we're getting raises because we make more nominal money.
Right.
But we don't get a raise unless the amount of more money actually represents more, purchasing power.
Right.
Which it basically doesn't.
Right.
Dean Baker of CEPR makes the point frequently, and did again just recently, that one of the most stimulative things one could do in the American economy right now would be to raise the minimum wage. Mm-hmm. The minimum wage is substantially below what it was in real dollars and real purchasing power, and actually simply raising the minimum wage would produce a much greater demand on the American economy that would produce the elusive jobs that the political parties keep saying they're going to produce by not doing anything. That's not going to happen. You're watching news from Neptune, and in which we deplore the present situation and deny the allegations and despise the alligators, as they say. We'll press on with David Green.
Thanks. I've been thinking lately about scapegoating, and particularly scapegoating the poor. I wrote a letter which appeared in the News Gazette last week in response to an editorial in which they had sort of gone off at the deep end in blaming poor young women who get pregnant and choose to have their their children for basically every problem on the face of the earth, of a kind of degenerating social pathology and so forth. And I've sort of been thinking about that sort of issue of, I explained myself in that letter in regards to what the systemic problems involved, which the editors choose not to acknowledge. But still, I've also been thinking that in the context of class issues and race issues, especially as they relate to the current sort of news climate, Trayvon Martin, the alleged anti-woman policies of the Republican Party, and how we're dealing with issues of the classic triumvirate of issues, class, race, and gender in the context of the current campaign, especially in regard to, say, the notion of playing the race card in response to Trayvon Martin, or as a very good article or very good op-ed piece in the New York Times pointed out this morning, playing the violence card in the way it's been done in turning around and blaming and saying that, well, one black young man was killed, but what about all the young black men who kill each other? And I got thinking about the term the dangerous classes, an old term going back at least a couple hundred years. And I found this little quote I'd like to read in response to that by the Italian philosopher or social theorist Antonio Negri. In a pardon?
That's it. Nothing. I just we haven't heard Tony's name for a while.
Yeah,
So
right. It's a little thing I found on the web under the title "The Poor: A Threatening and Indispensable Enemy, from the Dangerous Classes to the Danger of the Multitude." And he writes, "It is renowned that throughout the history of capitalism, the definition of the dangerous classes has been very flexible. In the era of manufacture, the poor were the dangerous. The multitude of penniless and vagabonds, agricultural workers, and landless peasants forced to move towards cities and factories. In the era of large industry, the workers became the dangerous class, assembled en masse in the factory. They exercised a pressure that affected all social relations. The dangerous class had to be pushed on the path of poverty, unemployment, and the industrial reserve army. Today, the poor is the enemy once again. In post-Fordism, the flexible worker, mobile and precarious, capable of producing cognitive and intellectual surplus, is the enemy, threatened by means of exclusion, as if poverty was not enough. And I guess sort of what I'm getting at here is sort of what's been swirling around in terms of Obama and the Democratic Party's response to these race-formulated issues, Trayvon Martin, or these feminist-formulated issues, i.e. the Republican primary and all the discourse about contraception and so forth, and ask whether we, and even in terms of the editorial which I responded to, the fact that the editors want to blame poor young women, but in the larger context, of course, and they want to avoid demonizing women as women and blacks as blacks or Hispanics as Hispanics, but they're not at all reluctant to pretty obviously demonize a class of poor people, albeit in the context of those poor people who bear too many children too young, and which the public pays for. So I guess what I'm raising is the issue of how is the Democratic Party, how do we respond to the fact that the Democratic Party certainly will benefit from this context in the midst of doing all the things that we're critical of them doing.
Comments, Ron?
Now, the thing what's remarkable to me is the tendency of people to moralize at the poor, to claim that they are poor because they are lazy or they have certain other moral defects. And if they would just work hard and get a job, work hard and display better character or work ethic and so on, they would be just fine. But at the same time, they never moralize at rich people. Such an idea is completely incomprehensible to them. But if the poor must, as a moral imperative, be made to work hard and make sacrifices and to learn the value of a dollar, why not the rich people? But we never hear that. And I'm concerned, frankly, just as much with the character of the rich as the moral character of the poor. But this seems to make me very much an outsider. So why aren't we equally concerned with moralizing at the mall? I think in part it's because of the widespread recognition of the bankruptcy of the notion that you work hard and get ahead and so on. What you do if you really want to get ahead is engage in office politics, cultivate the boss, and game the system. And a lot of people are, I think, recognizing that after years of hearing that they should be morally upright, virtuous, obey the rules, and work hard to make it within the system. Get your foot on the bottom rung of the corporate ladder, and if you play your cards right and work real hard, you'll rise to a position of wealth, power, and authority. And I'm afraid that's very largely discredited.
We talk about the similarities between the European situation and inequality there and inequality here.
Yeah.
And you pointed out a while ago, Ron, the recent studies that shows that social mobility is actually more possible in Europe than it is in America.
That's right.
And has been for a while.
Yes.
Yeah. There's an aspect of this that seems to me, this whole question, that is connected with the rise of neoliberalism more than 30 years ago. That's important. And in a sense, it's a version of the death of the liberal class argument. What actually happened to American liberalism, what we sometimes quite loosely call the left in America, since we don't have a traditional usage for that term. What happens to American liberalism in the age of neoliberalism seems to me to relate to the issues regarding race and gender that Dave is talking about here. I mean, to simplify brutally, the Democratic Party, which comes out of the Depression and the war, as the party that's fundamentally opposed in principle in a New Deal fashion to economic exploitation. That's what the Democrats, the party of the working man, are there for. In the great age of regnant American capitalism from the end of the Second World War to the 1970s. That's what the party does. That's what we are. We're New Deal, we're Roosevelt, et cetera, et cetera. What happens, of course, is that it's bound up with the peculiar politics of the 60s and 70s, is that this point is given up. Economic exploitation no longer is the cynosure of American liberalism. It's discrimination, racial and gender discrimination. The women's movement, the civil rights movement together produce a new sort of liberalism parallel to neoliberalism in the 1970s that take race and gender as their concerns and give up in simply by silence the former concerns with economic exploitation. One index of this is what happens to American unions. American unions, which are strong and numerous in the 1950s, disappear rapidly after the 1970s. There are other problems for liberals to deal with. Discrimination against blacks and women particularly. Now, certainly no one is going to speak up for discrimination against blacks and women. That's exactly why it was something that American liberals could adopt when they gave up their real raison d'etre, that is, their opposition to economic exploitation. They suddenly could become very excited about what came to be called early on political correctness or identity politics, because in fact they've already sold the store to neoliberalism, to this attempt to tear down the accomplishments of the New Deal instead of fighting for them. Because that's what neoliberalism was. It was an attempt precisely to reverse the social services, the income supports, Social Security, the other, and we see it played out now. And by the way, it wasn't limited to Republican administrations or Republicans on the political scene. Democrats did this happily as well, as we see in the current administration. Under those circumstances, we're left with this notion that there is a progressive politics to be found in opposing discrimination on the basis of race, class, or sex. Race, sex, or class. That's fine, and that triad was repeated any number of times, but people like Slavoj Žižek pointed out that the three were not, in fact, coordinate. That race and gender were in principle solvable by reconciliation. Class contradictions were not solvable by reconciliation. Exploiters had to be liquidated, if not in their physical being, at least in their social role. You can't have just good relations between exploiters and exploited without, in fact, changing the fabric of society. There is a contradiction there that's different from the contradiction found in questions of race and gender. Well, what's happening now, I think, is that matter is being reintroduced into American politics. Ron's opening remarks on inequality, growing inequality, seems to me to suggest that our politics are talking about class for the first time since the post-war period, when it was vigorously repressed. It's back on the agenda, and it's back on the agenda because the situation is so bad. Okay. Is it time then for liberalism to realize that, of course, discrimination is a bad thing, but that our real politics have to deal with the non-reconcilable contradictions in society, that is, the contradictions that arise from class?
Isn't it just in part the role of the Democratic Party to blunt the conflict by introducing what are called palliatives to prevent mass rioting in the streets by the underclasses, or the dangerous classes as they were called in Victorian times?
Unquestionably true. Yeah. I mean, and this, by the way, that goes back to the New Deal itself. Yeah. The New Deal, sometimes represented as an assault on capitalism, was in fact capitalism's salvation, obviously. What Roosevelt and his advisors saw was that if capitalism was going to survive in any way at all, if indeed something like the division of wealth that existed in America when the Depression broke out was not to be altered entirely, then steps must be taken to relieve the worst of the suffering. That's what the New Deal was. Yeah. It was a defense, in other words, of the existing order. Well, okay, good. It really did. It was objectively in the interests of the working class, as in the language of the time, language which interestingly dropped out for a while. That's all to the good. Yeah. But it left a lot of problems unsolved.
Yeah. So is it time for a new set of palliatives if the unrest becomes too obvious? In Latin America, for example, it's notorious that the privileged upper class, the countries that are essentially owned by the 15 families or whatever it is, has never been able to do this. And again, there have been coups and rioting and so on because they will always poo-poo what needs to be done in order to save the upper class or to save the nation as a whole. And can we do it?
But what, yeah, I mean, I guess what concerns me and what I was sort of trying to the issue I was trying to raise about the current electoral politics. I know, we try to distinguish between politics and policy, and not focus too much on who's ahead and behind in the polls and so on and so forth. But it just seems like with the nature of the Republican campaign sort of lobbing this big softball towards the quote-unquote feminist wing of the Democratic Party, and the Trayvon Martin incident, or murder, should be said, offering this big softball to Obama to go on and say, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon Martin. Right. With all these, I mean, it seems like everything is fine with race-based politics and with playing the race card, especially to the advantage of the Democratic Party.
Exactly.
I mean, this is all to the good, quote unquote. I'm not saying that anybody would plan any Democrats would plan any of this, but it's clear that most people feel in this, in the year 2012, most people understand perfectly well what happened to Trayvon Martin, and are appalled by it, and that's gonna work towards the race card, so to speak, and avoid and offer a clear opportunity for Democrats to avoid class-based politics.
Yeah.
I think that's quite right.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think that is precisely true.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we're operating, it seems, on the basis of images, slogans. And the Trayvon Martin case is what's sometimes called iconic. I'm not sure what people mean when they use that term. It's being used a lot. But yeah, it will have, I think, that role in the national narrative or whatever that you're suggesting.
I've mentioned before Thomas Pynchon's Proverbs for Paranoids, the first of which is, if they can get you asking the wrong question, they don't have to worry about answers. Well, yeah, that's right. And the wrong questions now are questions that avoid issues of class. Wrong questions are questions that avoid the financialization of the American economy under the pressure of neoliberalism and the offshoring of production in the American economy, so that we have the worst situation for a large percentage of the population in terms of income, as we were saying, that we've had for more than a generation. That's the question. The question is, whose law was it? Which of the right-wing economists in the Nixon administration? It was Herb Stein. Herb Stein's law,
yes.
That if things that can't go on won't. Well, I mean, the things that can't go on won't. All right. What's this present misleading of the American public about the nature of the economy and questions of class can't go on forever, and it won't.
Yeah.
But
well, yeah, some are saying, I don't know how many people recognize this, that the economy has been hollowed out because it's become a matter of shuffling the papers, permuting and recombining the certificates of ownership, and that's counted as economic activity.
Yep.
And the actual production of useful items has gone elsewhere. And I think the longer-term consequences of that are coming back to bite us. And how many people are waking up to this? I don't know.
Yeah, in response to the latest controversy about Apple's production facilities in China and an article and some reforms that were made, there was a precious letter in the New York Times from someone just saying, well, why can't Apple just bring the jobs back here.
Right.
And the letter writer said, I mean, it wasn't a bad letter. I don't mean to ridicule it. It probably needs to be said or at least asked to get people thinking about it. And the letter said, well, certainly they're making enough profits there. It wouldn't really matter if they had to pay U.S. wages as opposed to Chinese wages. And of course, what this person may or may not understand is the fact that, yes, it isn't just wages. It's the fact that the jobs are there and not here, because if the jobs were here, then you have to worry about all the other aspects of what workers do when they have good jobs and want better lives.
And the irony, in some sense, if that's quite the word, is the jobs may be coming back because the labor in America is now cheaper than the labor in China, as Chinese labor, in some places at least, becomes increasingly organized. We've already seen examples of plants coming back from Canada that fled abroad a generation ago. So I mean, maybe the same thing will happen to
the pay is a big deal, but it isn't the whole thing.
Right.
What's the control of the workforce?
And they're very worried about that in China indeed. I mean, it is a major political issue, and it's led to local revolts in China that, instead of being suppressed with the military or the police, have led to rearrangements, and that the Chinese authorities send in negotiators instead of the cops. That's interesting. In America, we see more examples of the cops being sent and far less negotiation. I think it will be seen as odd that the Obama administration did not take the steps that the early Roosevelt administration did in terms of social supports, jobs, the WPA, things like that. And if we really do reap the whirlwind in the American economy in coming years, people may point out that here was the chance to do that. Here was the chance to save capitalism, if you like, as Roosevelt did, and they didn't do it.
I just wanted to make one footnote to sort of all this in terms of Noam Chomsky and what he's been talking about lately. There was a short article in Truth Out, which is based on longer talks he's given recently, which are available on YouTube, about the educational system, mainly focused on the educational system. And what Chomsky is referring to in these articles is two sort of seminal documents from the early 70s. One is the so-called memorandum by Lewis F. Powell of the Chamber of Commerce at that time, and the other, which is referred to as the right-wing point of view from that time, and the other is the Trilateral Commission's much longer report of that time, which is identified with people like Samuel Huntington and so forth.
Mad Dog.
Yeah, and so I just think that it's fascinating to go back and look at what was being said 40 years ago, or in the case of the trilateral document, almost 40 years ago, and to see how that sort of foretold where our society was going, and especially Chomsky has been talking about it in the context of the backlash against the 1960s and the destruction of the public, especially the higher public education system, and so it's as much as I've watched and read Chomsky, I've continued to learn a lot from what he's saying. He always offers a little bit of a different twist on things.
That Trilateral Commission report from 1975 was called The Crisis of Democracy, and the crisis was very clear to the people in the Trilateral Commission, which was essentially a committee of the international 1%, we might say, although the term wasn't quite used at the time. The crisis of democracy in 1975 was just too much democracy going around, that people are too interested in having a say about policy, particularly economic policy, and something's got to be done. They got to be stopped from doing this one way or another. Policy has got to be insulated from politics, said the Trilateral Commission in 1975. Well, you'd think in less than 40 years they've done a pretty good job of that, and that the resurgence or the appearance of things like Occupy, I don't know how many things there are like Occupy, but what indeed these are, well, that's another question, as a matter of fact, that the resurgence of popular politics worries our present rulers greatly. I think one of the most important stories in the last week or two is the emergence of a well-funded, quite conscious attempt to co-opt the Occupy movement for the re-election of Barack Obama. This man Van Jones was given a full hour on Democracy Now! This week by Amy Goodman, who seems surprisingly unaware of the danger of co-option, to put it politely. The Move On organization, which was formed originally, of course, to insist that people move on from the Clinton impeachment, nothing's happening here, move along, make no difference, go back to politics as usual. The Move On organization spent a good deal of time in the last presidential election to try to convince the anti-war movement that what they really wanted to do was to elect Barack Obama, because of course that would bring the war to an end. And indeed the Move On movement co-opted as much of the anti-war movement as it could, did not campaign against Democratic legislators who were pro-war, but only against Republican legislators who were pro-war. Well, they've been remobilized now to convince the people who are attracted by the Occupy movement that the real goal of the Occupy movement is to make sure we elect another Democratic president. This is worse than dangerous. This is a blunting of the most important political force in American politics in a decade or more, and it should be called by its right name.
So in order to challenge the insulation of policy from politics, we need to go outside the party system as we know it?
Not only outside the party system, I think, David, but outside the electoral system. Nothing would please our rulers more, nothing would please Barack Obama more, than for people to believe that it really makes a difference whether Mr. Santorum or Mr. Romney becomes the Republican nominee. Nothing would please them more than to think that the election, and particularly the presidential election, encapsulated political discussion in this country. It seems obvious that to change the policies that have been followed consistently by the federal government for a generation, military as well as economic, only extra parliamentary means will be effective. Parliamentary means have been contained. Parliamentary means aren't effective. You have your choice between Tweedledum or Tweedledummer at most local elections, and the idea that voting would somehow change anything is increasingly recognized as false.
Do you think this is well understood enough by those who would oppose the co-optation of the Occupy movement?
I don't think it's understood at all. I think that, in fact, the purpose of the co-option movement, which is not limited to Move On, but certainly is centered there, is to make sure that people don't understand it. I mean, it's precisely to suppress that understanding, and to make sure that understanding doesn't get loose.
So, I mean, even though the Occupy movement has clearly been outside of politics as usual, and party politics and electoral politics, it hasn't quite understood clearly enough the idea of what they really are doing and what the implications of that are in relation to what's going on in electoral politics.
Well, I think that's probably right, but I mean, I think it's also one of those things that was emerging, that was becoming clear, that made the Democratic Party, for example, think that it really had to put on a serious co-option movement, because those notions were becoming clear. That it would, look, when the Southeast Asian war policy was reversed in this country in the 1970s. It wasn't reversed because the people in Congress were thrown out and new people who opposed the war were elected. There wasn't any such change. That didn't happen. What happened was that a series of forces, one and only one of which was the pressure of Americans demonstrating in this country, forced the American government to change its policy. I mean, the brave resistance of the Vietnamese people and the revolt of the American army in Vietnam had a good bit to do with it too. But these were all extra parliamentary, I mean, outside the the Congress outside the government, changes that made that change, such as it was in American policy in the 1970s, mainly withdrawal from Southeast Asia. The same thing is going to have to happen in regard to the American war in the Middle East and to the the real economic changes that should have supervened from the Great Recession. There's no other way for it to happen, and that's going to have to happen not because we elect a Democrat rather than a Republican or the other way around in the coming elections.
Yeah, well, while there's still hope to do things nonviolently and so on and within legal boundaries, I might mention before we have to stop here some of the local politics that may be coming up. And I think it's still worthwhile participating in that to some extent. But on Tuesday, April 10th, in Champaign and Urbana, there will be township meetings that will have on their agendas 2 items to be voted on by all registered voters in attendance. One item calls for the November ballot to have an item which urges representatives from the local and national level to endorse the amendment which declares corporations do not have the same rights as people and states that legislation should be pursued which challenges the Citizens United Supreme Court decision by reenacting curbs on corporate spending on elections. The other item is a measure which challenges the corporate enclosure of the commons by establishing laws in Champaign-Urbana which allow non-disruptive forms of free speech in areas where private business can currently prohibit it, such as private parking lots and malls. So if you think there's still a chance of affecting policies in this way, Tuesday evening, April 10th, a Champaign City building, if you're a Champaign voter, 7 p.m., 6 p.m. at the Urbana Civic Center on 108 East Water Street, the same evening if you are an Urbana voter. And I would encourage people who haven't completely lost hope of working within the system to do both these things. What do you think?
It's not an either or.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the point.
Sure.
It's the people who want to believe it's an either or, are running the present political system. Yeah.
Right.
Keep politics in here. Limits of allowable debate. That's what we want.
Right.
Even these proposals, worthy as they are, and I'll be there and vote for them and so forth, are formalities. Who can speak and where and so forth.
Yeah.
I mean, when we're fighting that far back, so to speak, we've got a long way to go.
But on the other side of the either or are the upcoming NATO or anti-NATO demonstrations planned in Chicago, which happen to be the weekend of May 19th and 20th. And I'm glad to see that some local people seem to be organizing around the idea of going up there and participating in whatever is going to happen, which of course isn't clear because they've moved out the G8, which was supposed to go along at the same time, and B, the Chicago government hasn't yet really offered a formal permit to the anti-NATO groups to conduct any action, but which still it still appears that there will be actions. What form they will take is not clear, but people are talking about that.
And if you want to hear more about this, look at the demonstration that will be held in downtown Champaign tomorrow afternoon from 2 to 4 p.m. Saturday afternoon from 2 to 4 p.m., the regular monthly demonstration of the anti-war, anti-racism effort here in Champaign. And the flyer that will be distributed, one of the flyers will be distributed at this demonstration specifically to do with the Chicago anti-NATO demonstration. So as a semi-mythical organization called SDS used to say long ago, everything's connected. You have been watching news from Neptune for April 6th in the 14th week of 2012. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky, and it occurs to me that we haven't discussed one of the more interesting local stories this week, and that is the retirement of our Congressman Tim Johnson, who the most important characteristic of whom was his objection his constant and consistent voting against the war in the Middle East. And the question is open as to whether his successor in the congressional seat for the 15th Congressional District will have his same anti-war credentials. I'm not sure he will.
He'll probably still be retired this time next week. So.
Yes, so we may have a chance to mention it again. Yes, and there is an election coming. The only reason that it might be worthwhile to talk about it now is that a third-party candidate would have to be out collecting signatures at the moment in order to get into the election. It's very hard to become a third-party candidate in the state of Illinois, and the circumstances of Mr. Johnson's retirement suggest that no third-party candidacy is going to occur. That is too bad. This has been News from Neptune for April 6th, as I say. Our program is named for Noam Chomsky. This has been the Good Friday Passover edition. If our program interested you, you might want to look at these programs heard regularly and repeated throughout the week here at Urbana Public Television. On Saturday, tomorrow at 7 a.m., the David Pakman Show. At 2 p.m., a repeat of this show. From 7 to 8 p.m. tomorrow evening, the Women's History Month specials. On Sunday, the 8th, at 5 a.m., the David Pakman Show, the sunrise service, I guess. At 7 a.m., the White House Chronicle. At 3:30 p.m., Alliance for Democracy, the Populist Dialogues. At 4 p.m., Labor's Worldview with our friends David Johnson and Jim Iman. At 11 p.m., Women's History Month specials, repeated. And next week, from Monday to Friday at 7 a.m., Democracy Now! At 8 a.m., The Big Picture with Tom Hartman, which I must say I've been watching more closely recently. I think he's getting better. Either that or my tastes are being educated. I'm not sure which. That program from 8 to 9 a.m., The Big Picture with Tom Hartman, is worth a look. At noon, the David Pakman Show, Monday through Friday. On Monday the 9th, from 2 to 5 p.m., Tom Hartman talks for 3 hours on the telephone in a live call-in show. At 5 p.m., the New Arab Debates #2, Tunisia's Islamists. This is a program from the series from the Middle East about the effects of the so-called Arab Spring. Tuesday the 10th at 7 p.m., European Journal from Deutsche Welle, an excellent program. 7:30 p.m., the New Arab Debates #1, Egypt is not ready for democracy. That's the topic being debated. At 8:30 p.m., the New Arab Debates #2, the topic, Tunisia's Islamists have won a dangerously large majority, close quote. These are formal debates when the resolution is being opposed and proposed in the course of the program. 9:30 p.m. on Tuesday, White House Chronicle, and at 10 p.m., Aware on the Air, starring Ron Szoke. You have been watching News from Neptune tonight. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants have been Ron Szoke and David Green. This and other editions of the program can be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com. And on Facebook, I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to our director, Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meanwhile, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.